Hello. In this video, we're going to be going over Neo-Russellianism as presented by David Brown and Nathan Salmon. So, Neo-Russellians, unlike Phrygians, are Millians in that they maintain that the content of proper names are just the things that they refer to. But in addition to that, they maintain that declarative sentences express Russellian propositions, where a Russellian proposition is an entity that is composed of an object that a noun phrase in a sentence refers to, as well as the properties that a predicate in the sentence in question express. So, one objection that neo-Russellians have had to overcome is the objection known as the problem of cognitive significance. Now, the problem of cognitive significance is a problem that was initially presented by Frege and Russell. And so we've seen variations of this with the problem of identity statements and the problem of propositional attitude ascriptions. So essentially, the problem of cognitive significance stems from the following principle. We'll call this the sufficient conditions for difference in cognitive significance principle. And this states that if there is a rational agent who understands two sentences and believes that one of these sentences is true while the other one is false, then that is sufficient to tell us that the sentences differ in cognitive significance. So for example, take sentence 1 and sentence 2. Sentence 1 says Hesperus is identical to Hesperus, and sentence 2 says Hesperus is identical to phosphorus. It seems possible that somebody could maintain that sentence 1 is true, maintaining that sentence 2 is false. Again, even though Hesperus and phosphorus are names that refer to the same object, namely the planet Venus, individuals can be ignorant of this fact, right? And so in this sense, it's possible that someone could think that sentence 1 is true while sentence 2 is false. But again, the point here is, according to the condition that we just laid out, both of these sentences, while they have terms that are co-referring, they differ in their cognitive significance, right? So again, going back to what Frege, the initial problems that Frege levied against the Millian view, well, sentence 1 and sentence 2 seem to express the same proposition, and if they do, then how do we account for cognitive significance in that case? Or the difference in cognitive significance. So here we can present that concern in an argument form. So let's assume that there's a rational agent that understands sentence 1 and sentence 2, but nevertheless they believe that sentence 1 is true while sentence 2 is false. Well, if this is the case, then that person differs in terms of the propositions expressed by 1 and 2. That is, that agent seems to believe one and the same proposition, only that they believe the proposition and its very negation, right? And this seems to be an entailment of the fact that the naive theory is true, or we should say, better said, is if the naive theory were true, then the naive theory or naive Russellianism is committed to the position that one can rationally believe the proposition expressed by sentence 1 and the negation of that proposition expressed by sentence 2. However, this should obviously strike us as impossible because there is no rational agent that can believe a proposition and its negation at the same time. We can perhaps maintain that that is actually antithetical to what rationality is. So the conclusion of this concern is that naive Russellianism must be false because it can't be the case that a rational agent can believe a proposition and its negation at the same time. So naive Russellians like David Brown and Nathan Salmon defend naive Russellianism against this argument by denying or arguing that premise 6 is actually false. So in other words, what they propose is that that a rational agent can in fact believe a proposition and its negation at the same time and still be rational, insofar as they do so in suitably different ways. So another way, Salmon puts it this way. we can account or explain how an individual, a rational person, can believe a proposition and its negation at the same time. But in order to do this, we need to give an analysis of belief not merely as a two-place relation between an agent and a proposition, but instead we need to do so as a three-place relation between an agent, a proposition, and what Salmon calls a propositional guise, or what Brown calls a way of believing or taking in a proposition, where guises or ways of believing a proposition are the things that are going to account for differences in cognitive significance. So there are two different approaches that have been proposed on how to properly execute this. So Nathan Salmon advocates what is called or known as the pragmatic approach. So under the pragmatic approach, what accounts for cognitive differences is going to be explained at the level of the pragmatics of the sentences in question. So pragmatics has to do with the study of how language is used within various different contexts. So for example, suppose that Bob asks the following question of Hector. Bob asks you, is Hector still working at that one place? And you respond by saying, he hasn't been fired yet. Well, in that situation, when you utter the sentence, he hasn't been fired yet, you are semantically expressing the proposition that Hector has not been fired from a particular location. But pragmatically, you have conveyed other information. You have conveyed perhaps information pertaining to Hector's poor performance at the job, or how unhappy you are with Hector at this particular location, working at this particular location. You have said more than merely what the words semantically express. You have pragmatically conveyed other information. So similarly, the pragmatic approach maintains that cognitive differences in how we take in certain information are going to be explained at the level of pragmatics and not at the level of semantics. So while sentence 1 and sentence 2 semantically express the same proposition, namely the Russellian proposition Hesperus identity, they pragmatically convey different information or express different pragmatic information. So sentence 1 can express perhaps the proposition, or pragmatically express the proposition that would be expressed with sentence 3, that the referent of the name Hesperus is identical with the referent of the name Hesperus, where sentence 2 pragmatically expresses the proposition that would be expressed with sentence 4, namely the sentence, the referent of Hesperus is identical with the referent of phosphorus, right? So this is why it's possible, according to Salmon, that one may think that sentence 1 is true while also maintaining that sentence 2 is false, even though they express semantically the same information, because what is accounting for the cognitive differences in how we are taking this information is going to be the pragmatics of the sentences in question, I should say. Another approach by neo-Russellians to account for differences in cognitive significance is known as the ways of believing approach, and this is the approach that David Brown takes. Now, in order to get a better understanding or sense of how the different ways of believing approach works, first let's consider the analog here of ways of speaking. So for example, suppose that Fred utters the sentence, "I am hungry," and Wilma also utters the sentence, "You are hungry," while addressing Fred. Well, it seems that there's a clear sense in which both Fred and Wilma have said the same thing. Namely, they have expressed the same information or proposition that Fred is hungry. However, they have done so in suitably different ways, right? Fred by uttering the sentence, "I am hungry," while Wilma does so by uttering the sentence, "You are hungry." So again, While Fred and Wilma say the same thing or convey the exact same information, they do so in different ways. Well, in a similar fashion, Brown maintains, an individual, a rational individual, can come to grasp or believe the same proposition and its negation as long as they do so in suitably different ways. Now, ways of believing aren't ways of taking in information based on certain linguistic conventions, but it's going to have to do more so with the psychological states that an individual is in when they are taking in or grasping a proposition. So perhaps there's a certain psychological state that somebody is in that would dispose them to perhaps express the belief that they have about the proposition that Hesperus is identical to Hesperus by uttering sentence one. And perhaps there can also be a different psychological state or a different way of believing that would be conducive to the disposition somebody would have to express that same proposition by uttering sentence two. Hesperus is identical to phosphorus. So while a rational agent can perhaps entertain or grasp the same proposition, they can do so in different ways. And we can see that they can do so in different ways because they are disposed to expressing this proposition by using different sentences. Now, with this in hand, right, likewise, we can also imagine that an individual who is ignorant perhaps of the fact that Hesperus is phosphorus can nevertheless grasp or believe the proposition that Hesperus is identical to Hesperus, right, and reject the proposition that Hesperus is identical to Hesperus as long as they believe it in a different way. Well, which way is that? Well, the way that would dispose them to express that information by means of sentence two, or perhaps the rejection of sentence two. So ultimately, from either of these approaches, as Neo-Russellians, the goal is to reject premise 6 of the argument against Neo-Russellianism by arguing for the position that propositions and their negations can be believed at the same time while still maintaining rationality insofar as they are done so in suitably different ways, whether that is at the level of pragmatics and linguistic conventions or whether that's at the level of psychological states that somebody is in. So that concludes this video.